At the end of the first act of Infamous, it's revealed that the gang you've been fighting are, in fact, brainwashed civilians. It's a reveal that puts something of a damper on the fun you've had up until this point. That the thugs you've been knocking off buildings and electrocuting are, in fact, the very same people that most players will have been trying to protect. I expected, at the very least, a reaction from Cole, who should be overcome by this same realization. And yet, this is a point that is never brought up again, despite all the unresolved implications that come with it. In fact, the very next island you head to has been taken over by an army of the homeless. While they're presented as being as violent and unstable as the rest of the factions, their characterization is such that a few of the missions make it seem like their homelessness is a bigger crime than their murder or extortion. It's a strange bit of writing, and while it didn't hinder my enjoyment of the game overall, it certainly took away my ability to play through the game mindlessly. On my commutes through Empire City, I kept on thinking about why the factions had been presented in this way, on the real-world topics the game had unwittingly brought up, and why all this bothered me so much. See, I'm not opposed to ultraviolence in games. If I were to lay out a list of my favorite games of all time, many of them are awash in murder and gore and a general disregard for human life. At the same time, these titles take care to contextualize all this, creating scenarios and enemies where all this feels appropriate. This is my real issue, I think, more so than the violence itself. It's who the violence is directed towards and how they're characterized that determine whether or not something will feel too violent. It's a sensation I've had over a variety of games, the feeling that the action was either accentuated by having some really contemptible villains, or was undermined because the writing hadn't found ways to justify the action. It's a thought I've seen crop up again and again throughout essays and video reviews, and, to me, stresses the importance of characterizing enemies so that they complement the action. Back to Infamous. I can feel the eye rolls and furious keyboard clicking now, that I'm making a big deal over some fairly minor issues, and really I should get over myself. But I know I'm right because the sequel addressed these concerns. Where the first Infamous had a bit of trouble in creating a legitimate threat out of the various gangs, the villains of 2 are far better suited to the experience. A fascist militia adorned with lost cause imagery, literal swamp monsters, and a band of crazed mercenaries imbued with ice powers. At the heart of all this is Joseph Bertrand, the man responsible for the creation of basically every threat in the game, from the monsters to the maniacs. While it's not subtle in the slightest, Colonel Sanders and his band of goons make for excellent enemies, thugs you can dispatch without any of the reservations or unsettling implications of the prior. In fact, comparing the two games shows how a few fairly small details can dramatically shift perception towards who you're fighting. Where the first game arguably has you punching down for much of the playtime, fighting gangs composed of the destitute and addicted, the second has you liberating not New Orleans from a tyrannical authority figure, putting you in something of an underdog role. Especially important are the brief lines of dialogues enemies shout at each other, giving players a reason to fight this particular group of enemies just as much as the larger story gives you a reason to take on this faction as a whole.
But it was only to provide security for you and your families. Now, isn't that worth any sacrifice?
It's especially noticeable then that the enemies of Infamous 1 are mute, as though the explosion that gave the player their powers took away the voice of everyone who would grow up to be fodder in a video game. It's a weird experience, one carried by the quality of the combat and mission design, but missing the emotional investment in the combat itself. I do feel that the poor characterization legitimately detracts from the game, fighting hordes of enemies that are enjoyable in mechanical terms, but don't have much heat behind them, underwritten to the point that it almost feels like your actions are overkill. Good characterization can legitimately elevate combat, as seen in Doom 2016. This is a game where you're ripping and tearing through enemies, but given that you're fighting literal demons, there's no question of, is this too violent, or is this wrong? It's both a fight for survival and a fight against the armies of hell, and you get the pleasure of totally immersing yourself in it. This is one of the many reasons the combat flows so seamlessly, I think, the developers understanding the effort required to make a game successfully mindless. Or at least mindless to anything outside of what implement of death to use on which demon. The enemies strike a great balance of menace and cartoonishness. Enough of each that the combat has a certain desperation to it, while the violence is couched by how over the top and silly both the demons and executions look. The Arkham series also demonstrates a keen understanding of characterization. One of the great pleasures of the series is the frankly absurd amount of dialogue the various henchmen have with each other. Aside from serving as a look into whatever villain they're working for and the politics of who owns what part of the city, it often gives the immediate encounters a bit more of a pop. Thugs go on about how tough they are, how Batman isn't really much of a threat, and what they'll do when they're finally free.
She's all alone down here with us. She should be scared. We're not nice people.
It's this combination of arrogance and cruelty that makes them all the more fun to terrorize. While you can take them down via the tried and true method of sneaking up behind them, I find that the game does such a good job of showing their facade breaking down that I'm actually inclined to keep my methods varied, taking each goon out from a different angle until you're left alone with one thug whose fear is palpable. It's an instance where the goons and their reactions elevate the experience, making what is fairly lax stealth gameplay into something more, casting you as something of a heroic slasher. These two titles also have the benefit of working within fantastical settings, where the fights are ones of good versus evil. If your cast is comprised of zombies, robots, or malicious entities, it's easier to design scenarios and enemies where this sort of worry never crops up. As Greg Kasavin, the creative director and writer of Transistor, notes in an article by Carly Velacci, there's a lot to take in at the beginning. One thing we didn't want players to worry about was the morality of these combat interactions. These creatures are clearly on the attack, so it goes without question that they should be destroyed. It's something that Infamous 2 demonstrates quite well, where each faction is so clearly evil that it makes the combat much easier to engage with, without any nagging feeling that your actions might be in the wrong. When gameplay is moved to more realistic settings, it takes greater effort to contextualize the combat, as it's harder to find antagonists that are so unremittingly evil. That said, sometimes attempts to humanize your enemies backfire so utterly that it can drag down the entire experience, as is the case with Tom Clancy's The Division. This is already a game where the intersection of its looter-shooter gameplay and vision of a post-apocalyptic New York run into some well-documented problems, but the moment that ripped me out of the game and ruined my ability to enjoy it was with the boss fight of the Rikers. They're a gang of escaped convicts led by a woman named Lorraine Barrett. During the middle of her fight, she drops this line. This inclusion has legitimately kept me up nights, trying to understand why on earth it was included. Now, I need to clarify. My issue is not with bringing up issues of police brutality, systemic racism, or the failures of the American prison system, or that I think politics and games are incompatible. If The Division was an RPG in the vein of Deus Ex, Fallout, or The Witcher, where these sorts of questions could have been raised and explored, this degree of nuance would be welcome, but The Division is not those games. This is not a game of characters or ideology, but of loot. Of gunning down waves of rioters so you can get your epic AK-47 or knee pads of plus 10 fire damage. Having her say this at this point is just bizarre, an inclusion you can't act on, say for killing her, so you're just left with this uncomfortable feeling that I doubt the game was meant to provoke, of thinking, am I the bad guy? And she brought up some legitimate issues. I suppose my grievance boils down to an issue of honesty. The attempt to imbue the fight with a degree of ambiguity or to tie it into larger social issues probably came out of a genuine desire on the part of someone within Ubisoft Massive. But it's a sentiment that runs counter to what The Division really is. This is an instance where less writing, or less thoughtful writing, would have served the game well. I wouldn't be writing this if he fought a guy in a hockey mask named Sledge who talked about how much he liked murder. It probably wouldn't have felt as meaningful in the writer's room, but it would have better complemented the reality of The Division, another boss who you'll fight, kill, and loot. But I think this is a great demonstration of the difficulty in creating enemies for a more realistic game, where, on the one hand, if you try to present them in a nuanced light, you can bring in a host of issues that the game can't hope to confront. But if you reduce them to simply being evil, you've created a world that feels totally hollow and artificial. This is a trap that I think many games with more realistic settings fall into, where the presentation of the world and some of the characters will receive a great deal of attention, but the player is meant to not think too hard about the motivations of their enemies or the fallout of their actions. That, of course, is where the realism stops. But it is possible to create enemies that are both contemptible enough to fight without worry, while also presenting them as human, a game that does it tremendously well. Half-Life. Among Half-Life's myriad accomplishments, I'm perhaps most impressed by how the developers handled the HECU Marines. So, about a third of the way into the game, the player has fought tooth and claw to reach the surface, in the hopes of linking up with a rumored military relief. You turn a corner only to witness a scientist being gunned down by a member of said relief, the government's idea of handling the Black Mesa incident being to kill everyone involved. This introduction is a great way to remove the worry of having to fight the response team, as we see how readily they kill civilians and the contempt they have for them. That said, as the player begins to gib and bludgeon every Marine in sight, their motivation for staying begins to change. Graffiti starts showing up calling out the player directly, and you can hear a conversation between two Marines talking about how Freeman killed their friends.
Really? All I know for sure is he's been killing my buddies. Oh yeah, he'll pay. He will definitely pay.
This is all in addition to them fighting an overwhelming alien force, and through playing, you can see the Marines take on more defensive positions, trying to survive the alien hordes and ambush the player. I hesitate to say that they become sympathetic due to the nature of their mission, but there is something of an understanding that forms between the player and the Marines, the later fights feeling desperate and angry as a result. In contrast to the Division's attempts to humanize its enemies at the last possible moment, this is a realization that will come fairly slowly, through overheard bits of dialogue, environmental storytelling, and miraculously, through gameplay. It's a deft bit of writing, and I think it shows that a game can have you fighting a human force that actually feels real and enjoyable to fight. It just takes a ton of work. I know that the discussion on violence in games is well-trodden territory, but I hope you've enjoyed this look at one particular aspect of it. As I said at the outset, I really enjoy games with an emphasis on combat, but I also think greater attention needs to be given to why certain games are able to weave in combat so naturally, while others make every digital death an unintentionally jarring experience. Who we're fighting makes up just a part of this, and questions of narrative, setting, and the characters we inhabit are also vital to providing the context needed to make combat enjoyable. More than there being a single best way of characterizing enemies, I think it's necessary for developers to be honest with themselves about the game they're creating. A title that puts players in ambiguous realpolitik situations might want to make the player uncomfortable, but sometimes a title is better served by casting any notions of ambiguity aside, allowing you to cut loose and focus on the decisions made in the heat of battle. I know I didn't cover every game that succeeds or struggles with how it portrays enemies, and I want to hear from you about any that have stuck with you. Enemy forces that are exceptionally fun to fight, due in part to how hateable they are, or antagonists that you felt uncomfortable killing because they were written in such a paradoxical way. There's a wealth of discussion to be had about this topic, and I plan to cover some other aspects of it, starting with a foray into some uncharted territory. Thanks for watching.